The sound of shattering glass tore through the lobby of the Ashworth Grand Hotel. Before hundreds of stunned eyes, a pregnant woman was shoved roughly, stumbling straight toward the enormous mirror on the wall. The glass split into a spiderweb, every crack stretching out like frozen lightning. One of her hands pressed against the broken surface to brace herself, the other curled around the gentle swell of a belly 5 months along. Delamarche did not cry out for help. She only doubled over, pouring every last instinct into shielding the unborn child within her. The woman in the red dress behind her still would not let go. Cordelia Vance was certain that no one in this room would dare lay a finger on her. A few words, and she would turn that insolent little waitress into the one at fault, then smooth out her silk gown and walk away as if nothing had happened. Money had always bought her that. Power had always stood on her side. But there was one thing Cordelia did not see. At the far end of the lobby, a man in a black suit rose quietly from his table. A tattoo ran along his neck, and his eyes were cold enough that the crowd instinctively parted to clear his path. He was the true owner of this hotel, a name the city's underworld spoke only with caution. And the woman now pinned against that mirror, years ago, on a rainy night she had long since forgotten, had once been the only person to save his life. He began to cross the lobby, one step at a time. Cordelia Vance had no idea that within the next few hours, the entire empire her family had built would begin to crumble piece by piece, and the reckoning coming for her would be heavier than anything she could ever imagine. Stay with us until the very end, because the truth behind tonight will leave you breathless. If this story moves you, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Royce Calloway's hand settled around Cordelia's wrist, lightly, but with enough force for the entire hall to understand that everything had just changed hands. He didn't yank. He didn't shout. He only tightened his grip once, firmly and decisively, and the fingers clutching Della's hair suddenly loosened, as though they, too, were afraid. Della pitched forward, one hand still wrapped around her belly, and Royce caught her by the shoulders before she could collapse onto the stone floor. The entire hotel lobby fell silent. The background music still lingered in the air, but no one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Cordelia jerked her hand back, her face flushed more with insult than shame. She hadn't yet seen the man before her clearly. All she saw was someone who had dared to interfere in her business. "Who are you to touch me?" she snapped, swinging one hand out to point straight at Della. "This waitress is the one who caused trouble. She was rude. She spilled something on me. Everyone saw it." Her voice rang out shrill and sharp, trying to pull the crowd back to her side, trying to rebuild the upper hand she believed she could never lose. Royce didn't look at her right away. He turned to Della and lowered his voice until it was just loud enough for her to hear. "Sit down here. Slowly. Don't stand up." He guided her to the nearest velvet-upholstered chair, carefully, as though he were holding something fragile. Della sat down trembling, both hands pressed against the curve of her belly, and the first words that broke from her lips weren't a complaint, weren't a cry of resentment. "My baby," she whispered, her eyes reddened with fear. "Is my baby all right?" Just those 3 words alone seemed to choke the entire hall into stillness. A woman standing near the front desk lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Someone quietly took out a phone. Above them, the small red light of the security camera blinked steadily, coldly, recording everything. Royce lifted his head, and this time he looked straight at Cordelia. There was no rage in his eyes, no shouting fury, but that gaze made her step back half a pace before she even realized she had moved. "Call medical help," he said, not raising his voice, yet every word fell like stone. "Call them now." The 2 security guards who had been standing frozen finally snapped awake. One immediately pressed his radio, while the other ran toward the door. From the corridor, a middle-aged woman in the gray suit of hotel management hurried over, her sharp eyes sweeping once across the scene. It was Mrs. Petrova, the restaurant manager, a woman who had worked at the Ashworth Grand long enough to understand that some kinds of trouble couldn't be settled with money. She recognized Royce, and when she did, the color of her face changed completely. She gave a slight bow and said, "Mr. Calloway," then turned and gave the staff firm orders. "Clear the way. Keep the guests calm. Don't let anyone touch her." The name Calloway passed through the crowd like a cold wind. A few people began to whisper. Others turned pale. Cordelia still didn't understand what was happening, but she began to feel that something was wrong. Why was everyone looking at her that way? Why had the manager bowed to the man who had dared to touch her? At that moment, through the revolving door, A man in a dark suit hurried in, still holding his phone in one hand, calling Cordelia's name with irritated impatience. It was Harlan Vance, her fiancé, the man who had just stepped away from a call to come looking for his future wife. "What trouble have you caused now?" he grumbled. But before the sentence was finished, his gaze landed on the man standing beside Della. Harlan froze in the middle of the lobby. His entire face went white in an instant, as though he had just seen a sentence handed down against him. That man, the man whose contract he had eagerly prepared documents for that very morning, the man he had waited weeks to meet because the deal could change his life, was the very one standing there now, quietly shielding the woman his future wife had just attacked. "Royce," he stammered. "Mr. Calloway, I didn't know." Royce slowly turned his head and looked at Harlan, and in that moment, all three members of the Vance family understood that this night wouldn't end the way they had imagined. As Petrova directed the staff to clear a path, and the crowd slowly began to spread out, Royce lowered himself onto one knee beside the chair where Della was sitting, trying to steady her with his calm, deep voice. "Breathe slowly. Medical help is almost here," he said. Della gave a weak nod, her hand still pressed to her belly, and when she lifted her face to answer him, she breathed out a sentence she didn't even seem to notice herself saying. "Thank you. You don't need to trouble yourself over me." Those words, the way she placed apology before her own pain, made Royce go still. He had heard that somewhere before. Not the exact words, but that voice, that rhythm, that strange patience of someone who always worried about others before herself. His eyes lowered to her hand, the hand resting against the curve of her belly, and on the back of her right hand was a small crescent-shaped scar, faded by the years. Royce's heart seemed to miss a beat. He had seen that scar before. He had once held that hand. The noisy world around him suddenly receded, and for one brief moment, he was no longer in this glittering hotel lobby. Many years earlier, on a night when rain poured down at the edge of the city, a young man had collapsed beside a dark alley, a deep injury staining his shirt, his breath coming in broken fragments. Behind him came the footsteps of men hunting him, the beams of their flashlights sweeping wildly through the curtain of rain. He had thought he would die there, cold and nameless, until a door opened a crack and a small hand pulled him inside. It was a young woman, thin and slight, wearing a coat worn thin with use. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he was hurt. She didn't ask who those men were. She only locked the door in silence, turned off the lights, pulled him into a shadowed corner, then took a clean piece of cloth and pressed it against his painful wound. When the footsteps stopped right outside the door, she stood between him and danger, holding her breath, one hand still pressing the cloth tight to stop the blood, and it was during that struggle with the bandage that a shard of broken glass on the floor cut a crescent-shaped wound across the back of her hand. She didn't make a sound. She only clenched her teeth and stayed silent until the footsteps outside drifted away, then vanished completely. The next morning, when he woke, she had left a cup of warm water beside him and disappeared before he could even ask her name. He searched for her for many years after that, but the city was too vast, and that girl had seemed to dissolve into the rain. Back in the present, Royce was still kneeling there, staring at the scar on Della's hand, and inside his chest rose a feeling he had believed had been dead in him for a very long time. It was her, the girl from that rainy night, the one who had saved his life without needing to know who he was, without asking for a single word of thanks, then quietly walked away. For all these years, he had built an empire, had planted fear and caution throughout the underworld, and yet the only person who had ever reached out to him when he was nothing at all was sitting here now, carrying a life inside her, after someone had just forced her head toward a mirror right in front of his eyes. Royce tightened his jaw, a cold anger rising in his gaze, but he didn't let it show in front of her. He only asked softly, his voice rough in a way that didn't sound like him at all. "What's your name?" "Della," she answered, unable to understand why this strange man was looking at her with such an unusual expression. "Della Marsh." She looked at him without the slightest recognition. To her, he was only a powerful gentleman who had happened to step in and help, a stranger in the middle of the crowd. She had no idea that the man kneeling before her had owed her his life for all those years, and that fate had just closed a circle that both of them, in very different ways, had never truly forgotten. The hotel medical team arrived only a few minutes later, pushing a stretcher and carrying a first aid bag. They knelt beside Della, asked her a few short questions about the pain, about the baby's movements, then gently helped her up. Royce rose to his feet and ordered one of Mrs. Petrova's people to go with her all the way to the ambulance and not leave her side for even half a step. Della looked back at him once, her eyes filled with gratitude and confusion. Then she was taken out of the lobby. Only after her figure had disappeared beyond the doors did Royce slowly turn around, and this time, all of his deadly calm gathered toward the two Vances. Cordelia was still trying to hold on to her defiant expression, but her hands had begun to clench tightly together. Harlan looked like a drowning man, stammering as he searched for words. "Mr. Calloway, this is only a misunderstanding. My fiancé just has a bit of a temper. We still have the contract. We can still sit down and talk." Royce didn't answer at once. He took one slow step forward, and both Harlan and Cordelia instinctively stepped back. "I've read your file," Royce said, his voice even and cold as frozen water. "I was prepared to sign tomorrow morning. I was going to put enough money into your company to save it from bankruptcy." He paused for a beat, his gaze passing over Cordelia before returning to Harlan. "But I just witnessed the way your family treats a defenseless woman. And someone who is willing to trample on those weaker than themselves is also willing to trample on anyone, including a business partner." Harlan went deathly pale, then quickly turned toward his future wife, his face twisting with panic. "This is your fault," he snarled. "All of this is because you couldn't control yourself. You've just destroyed everything I built." Cordelia stared wide-eyed at the man who, only moments earlier, had been her support, unable to believe he could turn on her so quickly. "You dare blame me," she hissed, but her voice had already lost the triumphant sharpness it had carried at first. Royce cut them both off with one sentence. "The contract is terminated." Those words dropped into the lobby like a steel door slamming shut. Harlan staggered as though his spine had been pulled out of him. "Mr. Calloway, please. My company will collapse without this investment. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. Please reconsider." Royce looked at him, and for the first time, a trace of contempt flickered through his voice. "You should have thought about that before you allowed your fiancé to attack a pregnant mother in the middle of my hotel lobby, right in front of me." The way he pressed into the words "my hotel" made both Harlan and Cordelia realize a chilling truth at the same time, that they had caused trouble in the very territory of the most powerful man they had ever tried to flatter. Cordelia opened her mouth, intending to say something else, some excuse, some challenge. But when her eyes met Royce's, every word died in her throat. For the first time in her life, she felt that the power she had always trusted, the money and reputation her family wore like armor, had suddenly become thin and meaningless. The man before her didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't need to do anything at all, and yet his presence alone was enough to make the whole room tilt toward him. This was something her money had never been able to buy. Royce turned and walked away, leaving the two Vances rooted in the center of the lobby beneath the searching eyes of the guests. Before he disappeared completely, he stopped beside Mrs. Petrova and quietly gave her a few instructions. "Keep all the camera footage from tonight, back it up. Don't let anyone delete or alter a single frame." Mrs. Petrova nodded, and in that moment, though no one had said it aloud, Cordelia dimly sensed that this night, the one she had believed was entirely under her control, was in fact only the beginning of something far larger waiting to come crashing down. The hospital room on a high floor of the central hospital was far quieter than the chaos that had just passed. Beside the bed, a fetal heart monitor gave off steady, rhythmic sounds, and each beat that rang out made Della breathe a little easier. The doctor had examined her carefully and told her in a reassuring voice that the baby was still fine. The heartbeat was strong, but she needed several days of absolute rest and had to avoid all stress and any physical impact. Della nodded, placing her hand over her belly, silently thanking heaven and earth that the most important thing was still safe. But the moment her fear for the child began to ease, another worry immediately took its place. She looked around the clean, comfortable private room, looked at the expensive equipment, and her mind began to calculate. She worked as a waitress, and her wages were only barely enough to carry her from one month to the next, saving every dollar she could for the day she would give birth. Even one night in a room like this was far beyond anything she could afford. When a female nurse came in to check on her, Della timidly asked about the cost, trying to keep her voice calm, though she couldn't hide the strain in it. The nurse flipped through the file and smiled. "You don't need to worry about that. The entire hospital bill has already been paid in full." Della froze. "Who paid it?" she asked, a feeling she couldn't describe rising inside her. The nurse shook her head. That person wanted to remain anonymous and only said that you should feel at ease and receive treatment. She should have felt relieved, but instead Della felt her heart sink. Her whole life, she had been used to taking care of herself, used to owing no one anything, and that self-respect was the one thing that had helped her stand through so many storms. An unnamed debt, a kindness whose source she didn't know, wasn't salvation to her, but a burden that left her uneasy. She said softly to the nurse, "Please tell me how much I owe. I want to pay it myself. I'm not used to accepting something I can't repay." At that exact moment, the door to the room opened, and Royce stepped inside, still in his dark suit, still carrying that calm presence that seemed to make the air around him settle. The nurse gave a slight bow and withdrew. Della recognized him at once, the man who had helped her in the hotel lobby, and she quickly sat up straighter, flustered. "You," she said. "You didn't need to come all the way here. I'm fine now. Thank you for earlier." Royce pulled a chair closer but didn't sit too near her. He kept a courteous distance, as though he understood that this woman needed a space of her own. "What happened took place in my hotel," he replied, his voice composed. "So I have a responsibility to make sure you're properly cared for." It was a gentle lie, a veil he deliberately let fall between them, because he knew that if he told her the truth now, it would be even harder for her to accept. Della was silent for a moment, then looked straight at him, her eyes still tired but strangely firm. "Were you the one who paid my hospital bill?" Royce neither confirmed nor denied it. He only answered, "Don't worry about that. What matters right now is that you and the baby are healthy." Della shook her head, her lips pressing together. "I'm grateful for what you've done, truly, but I can't accept such a large amount of money from a stranger. I'll find a way to pay you back, no matter how long it takes." There was no weakness or shame in her voice, only the quiet pride of someone far too used to standing on her own 2 feet. Royce looked at her, and inside him rose an emotion he couldn't quite name, because it was that very strength, that very way she refused pity even when she was at her lowest, that made him remember all the more clearly the girl from years ago who had saved him, and then quietly turned away without needing a single thing in return. Royce stayed beside the hospital bed a while longer, silently watching the woman who still insisted on paying back money she didn't have. That stubborn strength should have irritated him, because very few people dared refuse anything he offered. But in Della, it stirred a distant memory he had buried very deep. "You know," he suddenly said, his voice sinking lower, "my mother used to be like you. She always wanted to carry everything herself, and never wanted to hold out her hand and ask anyone for anything." Della looked up, a little surprised, because she hadn't expected a cold, powerful man like him to speak of his mother with such tenderness. Royce wasn't looking at her. His eyes were turned toward the window, where the city lights shimmered far away. "She once worked as a servant in a grand mansion," he said, slowly, each word seeming carefully chosen. "She worked herself to exhaustion from early dawn until late at night, cleaning, cooking, serving people who believed they had the right to treat her as less than an object." He paused for a beat, his jaw tightening slightly. Some of them enjoyed watching others lower their heads. They enjoyed the feeling of trampling on someone who couldn't fight back, just to prove they stood above them. "My mother endured that for many years, patiently, silently, because she had no other choice, because she had a child to raise." Della listened, her heart tightening, because in the story of this unfamiliar man, she saw the faint reflection of her own life. All the times she had been forced to bow her head and swallow humiliation in order to keep her job, in order to have money for the child soon to be born. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Royce turned back to look at her, and in those eyes that were usually as cold as ice, there flickered a different kind of light. "Because I want you to understand," he replied, "that when I see someone powerful raise a hand against someone weaker, I can never stand still and watch. I saw my mother come home too many times with red eyes and no words. I once knew what it felt like to be helpless, because I was too young to protect her. When I grew old enough, I promised myself I would never let myself fall into that helplessness again, and I wouldn't fold my arms and stand by when I saw someone treated the way my mother had been treated." That was why he had been there in the hotel lobby that night. That was why he couldn't simply walk past when he saw a pregnant woman being forced down in front of a crowd. Della stayed silent for a long while, then said quietly, "I'm very sorry for what your mother went through, and I'm glad she had a son who still remembers her that way." Royce nodded and didn't answer, but something inside him had been awakened. He didn't tell her that the woman who had saved him on that rainy night years ago had carried that same quality. The quiet resilience of people at the very bottom who still didn't lose their self-respect. He couldn't say it yet. Not now. He only stood, straightened the front of his suit jacket, and before leaving, he stopped by the door and looked back at her once more. "Rest until you're truly well," he said. "Everything else can wait. As for the hospital bill, if it keeps you from feeling at ease, then consider it a debt, and someday you can repay it in your own way." Della watched him disappear beyond the door, her heart tangled with thoughts. She didn't understand why a man like him would care so much about a poor woman like her, and she couldn't possibly know that the invisible thread tying the two of them together had been knotted many years earlier, on a rainy night she had forgotten, while he had remembered it forever. After a few days of rest, Della was discharged from the hospital and returned to the ordinary rhythm of her life. But there were things she didn't know had quietly changed around her. Mrs. Petrova suddenly began assigning her lighter shifts, keeping her away from crowded areas and banquet tables where trouble could easily arise. When she came home late from work, there was always a car parked silently at the corner of the street, and the driver only left after seeing her step safely through the door of her boarding house. Della thought it was coincidence, or perhaps a new hotel policy. She couldn't imagine that Royce had arranged it all, quietly weaving a net of protection around her without letting her feel that she owed anyone anything. He didn't appear often, but now and then, he would stop by the restaurant during quiet hours, sit in a hidden corner, and watch her work from a distance, only to make sure she was still all right. One rainy afternoon, when Della finished her shift and was struggling in the parking lot because the chain on her old bicycle had slipped loose while the rain was pouring down, Royce happened to pass by. He stopped, took off his coat and laid it over the bicycle frame, then, without saying much, bent down and fixed the grease-covered chain for her with the same hands that were used to signing million-dollar contracts. Della hurriedly tried to stop him. "Don't do that. Your hands will get dirty. I can manage it myself." But Royce only looked up, the corner of his mouth touched by a rare hint of a smile. Sometimes people need to let someone else lend a hand. Not every debt has to be repaid with money. Those words made Della freeze. She looked at the man kneeling beside a puddle, his white shirt stained, his hair damp with rainwater, and for the first time, she saw something in him completely different from the frightening coldness the whole city whispered about. People said he was the kind of man who made the entire underworld tread carefully, and yet here, in this ordinary, rainy afternoon, he was bending down to repair an old bicycle for a poor waitress, asking for nothing, displaying nothing. When he finished, he stood, wiped his hands on a paper towel, then let her go first and told her to get home safely. Della rode away through the rain, her heart tangled with an emotion she couldn't name, a strange warmth she hadn't felt in a very long time. She didn't know that from the moment Royce had stepped forward to protect her in the hotel lobby, their two worlds, once separated by an almost impossible distance, had begun to touch. And she also didn't know that this closeness had already fallen under the eyes of people who meant no good at all. Not far away, in a dark room overlooking the city through thick glass, an older man sat behind a large wooden desk, slowly turning a glass of liquor in his hand as a subordinate placed several photographs before him, photographs of Royce bending down to fix Della's bicycle. It was Lincoln Brandt, an underground power who had quietly fought Royce for territory for many years. A man who had always waited for one opening to bring down the rival he had never been able to subdue. He picked up one photograph, narrowed his eyes at the woman's face in it, then smiled faintly, his expression full of calculation. "For so many years, Calloway hasn't had a single weakness," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. "And now he's finally revealed a soft place." He set the photograph down on the desk, his finger tapping lightly on Della's face, and in his eyes gleamed a coldness more terrifying than hatred. "Find out everything about this woman for me," he ordered. "Sometimes, when you want to bring down a sturdy tree, you don't cut into the trunk. You find its weakest root." In the days that followed, Della tried to return to work as though nothing had ever happened, but she soon realized that everything was no longer the same. The night in the hotel lobby had become a subject of gossip everywhere, and even though she was the one who had been hurt, the whispers didn't stand on her side. Each time she carried a tray past the kitchen or the staff changing room, the murmuring would fade, then fall silent altogether, only for a few eyes to follow her with hidden meaning. Some people were curious, some pitied her, but there were also more than a few who were jealous. They whispered among themselves that the dirt-poor waitress had somehow caught the eye of the true owner of the hotel himself, that there must have been something shady behind it for a man as powerful as Mr. Calloway to personally step in and protect her that way. Those poisonous rumors clung to Della like invisible thorns, and though she knew they weren't true, there was nothing she could do to explain herself. All she could do was lower her head and work even harder, taking on the heavy tasks that others avoided, as if she wanted to prove that she remained here through her own sweat and effort, not because of anyone's special favor. But her body was no longer hers alone. The pregnancy had entered its 6th month, and her growing belly made every step heavier. Her legs swelled after long shifts, and by the end of each day, her back ached so badly that she wanted nothing more than to collapse. And yet she kept going, kept smiling at the guests, kept carrying heavy trays of food up flight after flight of stairs, because she understood that she had no right to rest. Every dollar she earned now wasn't only to keep herself alive, but to prepare for the day her child came into the world, so that her baby wouldn't have to be deprived from the very first breaths of life. On some evenings, when the restaurant had emptied of guests, Della would quietly sit down in a hidden corner, place her hand over her belly, and breathe deeply to push back the exhaustion rising inside her. She told herself that she only had to try a little longer, that if she could just get through this stretch, everything would be all right. Mrs. Petrova sometimes looked at her with worried eyes and more than once gently reminded her not to overwork herself, but Della only smiled, thanked her, and went on. She didn't want anyone to be troubled because of her, and she didn't want to be seen as someone leaning on other people's pity. Yet the pressure didn't come only from the gossip or from her worn-out body. In the air, there seemed to be something smoldering that she couldn't name, a vague unease that clung to her like a silent shadow. A few times, she felt as though someone was watching her, an unfamiliar gaze flickering through the crowd before vanishing, a figure lingering too long on the street corner across from her boarding house. She comforted herself by thinking it was only fatigue making her suspicious, that she was worrying too much. She couldn't know that her instinct wasn't without reason, that from hidden corners she couldn't see, cold eyes were quietly watching her every step, every habit, every weakness, patiently waiting for the right moment. Della continued to push through each day with the burden on her shoulders and the fragile belief that the worst storms had already been left behind, never knowing that the real tempest had only just begun to move in, and this time it was aimed straight at the most precious thing she was struggling day and night to protect. The collapse of the contract had driven Harlan Vance into a corner, and a desperate man was willing to do anything to recover what he had lost. When Lincoln Brandt quietly came to him with an offer, Harlan didn't hesitate. Two men who had never liked each other suddenly found common ground in one thing, their hatred for Royce Calloway, and the name that tied them both to that hatred was none other than Della. Brandt had investigated carefully enough to understand that this poor waitress was the soft place he had been searching for all this time, and to reach her, he didn't need violence. He only needed to destroy the most precious thing she still held, her honor. The plan was laid out with meticulous cruelty. Among the hotel staff was a storeroom manager who had been reprimanded by Mrs. Petrova many times for his dishonesty, a man nursing resentment and drowning in debt. Brandt's people came to him, placed enough money on the table to erase every hesitation in his conscience, and in return, he only had to do one thing: build a story. One afternoon, when Della was assigned to inventory work in the storage area behind the restaurant, a secluded place where the security cameras couldn't reach, the trap began to close. The storeroom manager took an expensive watch and a stack of cash that a wealthy guest had left for safekeeping, then secretly hid them inside the old handbag Della had left in the changing room. At the end of the shift, when the guest reported the missing property, he immediately raised his voice and pointed all suspicion toward the waitress who had just left the storeroom, the only person who had been there throughout the afternoon. The search took place right in front of everyone, and when the watch and the cash were pulled from Della's own bag, the whole room seemed to fall dead silent. Della stood frozen, her face drained of color, her lips trembling for a long time before she could finally speak. "It wasn't me. I swear I never touched these things. Someone put them in my bag." But the evidence was lying right there in plain sight, and her explanation dissolved among the doubtful eyes and whispers that had been waiting for a long time. The storeroom manager triumphantly poured more oil onto the fire. He said he had suspected her for quite a while, that someone as poor and desperate as she was would dare do anything. Because there were no cameras in the storage area, everything became her word against his. And on that scale, The disadvantage had already been set to fall on the weaker person. Della was suspended from work immediately pending investigation, and the honor she had tried to preserve with all her self-respect was smeared in a single afternoon. She walked out of the hotel beneath the scrutinizing eyes of others, one hand holding her belly, the other gripping the strap of the bag that had become evidence against her. And for the first time since that fateful night, she felt as though the ground beneath her feet was giving way. The news quickly reached Royce, and when he heard his people recount the entire incident, he immediately understood that this wasn't an ordinary theft. He knew too well what kind of person Della was, understood too clearly that a woman willing to insist on paying back every dollar of her hospital bill would never steal from anyone. This was a trap, set with cold calculation, and its true target wasn't her. Royce stood silently by the window, his eyes darkening as each piece of the puzzle gradually became clear. Someone had deliberately targeted Della, not because of any grudge against a poor waitress, but because they knew that hurting her was the way to draw him out of the shadows, to force him to reveal himself and act. They were using her as bait, and Royce understood that whoever stood behind this move was no ordinary opponent. The trap set in the storage area dragged Della into a chain of collapse so quickly that she had no time to defend herself. Only one day after being suspended, she received an official notice that her employment contract had been terminated while the incident was being investigated, which meant that the only source of income keeping her and the child in her womb alive had suddenly been cut off. She tried going to several other restaurants and diners in the city, hoping to find temporary work, but the rumor about a pregnant waitress caught stealing a guest's property had spread faster than she imagined. Everywhere she went, she was met with shaken heads, guarded eyes, and sometimes blunt refusals that no one bothered to disguise. One manager even made a mocking remark that they couldn't hire someone with a bad reputation, especially when that person was so close to giving birth. One door after another slammed shut in front of her, and Della slowly realized that her stained honor had become an invisible sentence following her everywhere. But disaster didn't stop there. Without wages coming in, she began falling behind on the rent, and after just over 1 week, the landlord, who had never had much sympathy for her in the first place, came straight to her door. He said plainly that he had heard all the rumors about her, that he didn't want to get involved with someone suspected of theft, and that he needed the room for a new tenant who was ready to pay on time. Della tried to negotiate, asking for a few more days, promising she would find a way to gather the money, but the landlord only waved a cold hand and gave her a short deadline to move out. And so, within a brief stretch of time, the woman who had already had almost nothing in her hands now lost even the last few things she had left. She lost her job, lost her place to live, and lost even the decent regard of the people around her. She packed everything she owned into 2 old bags, a few sets of clothes, a handful of personal belongings, and the meager savings she had scraped together for the day she would give birth. Money she now had no choice but to use just to cling to each passing day. She left the cramped rented room that had once been the only home she had, stepping out onto the street with her swollen belly and heavy luggage weighing down her shoulders. She went from one cheaper boarding house to another, but some were full, some demanded a deposit she couldn't afford, and some refused her the moment they saw her standing alone with a pregnancy so close to term. On the first night she had nowhere to go, she could only curl up on a bench in the waiting area of the bus station, holding both bags tightly in her arms, silently watching the stream of people passing back and forth. Through those dark days, what made Della worthy of respect was that she never once knocked on anyone's door to beg. She didn't go to Royce, even though a single word to him could have solved all her hardships in an instant. She didn't pour out her misery to Mrs. Petrova. She didn't complain to any of the few acquaintances she still had left. Self-respect had sunk so deeply into her, like a part of her own blood and flesh, that it wouldn't allow her to turn herself into a burden or an object of pity. She endured in silence, struggled in silence, knocking on door after door by day to ask for work, even though she already knew most hope was useless, then searching by night for a hidden corner sheltered from the wind, where she could close her eyes for a little while. People watched her pass by, a pregnant woman quietly dragging her belongings through the cold streets, never knowing that behind that exhausted figure was a will that had not yet fallen, and no one knew that from the darkness there were still eyes following every step she took, noting every place she stopped, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, Della found a cheap, rented room on the edge of the city, a tiny room with stained walls and a window that couldn't shut out the wind, but at least it was a roof over her head for the night. She sat with her back against the old bed frame, pulled the thin blanket over her legs, which were swollen after a long day of dragging herself from place to place. And in the stillness of the darkness, she placed both hands over the curve of her belly. The baby moved softly, a gentle kick against her palm, and that tiny motion alone made her eyes sting. "My sweet child," she whispered into the night, her voice trembling yet strangely tender. "Do you know that today you kicked so strongly? I know you're still here with me, still healthy, and just that is enough to give me courage." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, because this was the only moment of the day when she allowed herself to be weak, allowed herself to release everything she had forced herself to hide from the entire world. "I know everything is hard right now," she went on, as though the little child inside her could hear and understand every word. "You and I have nothing in our hands. We don't have a place to call home. We don't have anyone to lean on. And out there, people are thinking things about me that aren't true. But believe me, my child, I've never done anything that would make you ashamed, and I'll never let you grow up inside that lie." She gently stroked her belly, her lips trembling into a smile through her tears. "I promise you, no matter what happens, even if I have to work until I'm exhausted, even if I have to walk all over this city and knock on every door, I'll never give up. I'll stand up again, because you need me, and you're the reason I won't allow myself to fall. You'll be born healthy, you'll have a decent life, and someday, you'll be proud of me. I swear that to you." In that shabby room, amid the cold slipping through the cracks in the window and the loneliness closing in from every side, the young mother's promise sounded softly yet firmly, like a small flame kindled in the dark, fragile but unwilling to go out. She thought of her own mother, the woman who had raised her alone through hardship and never complained even once, and she understood that now it was her turn to carry on that quiet strength. She didn't pray for wealth. She didn't dream of some miracle that would change her life overnight. She only asked for enough will to keep moving forward, enough strength to reach the day when she could hold her child in her arms. Della closed her eyes, rested her head against the wall, and for the first time, after those endless, exhausting days, a strange peace slipped into her soul, not because her circumstances had grown any better, but because she had found again the strongest support within herself, the love she carried for the child who had not yet been born. Outside the window, the city still lay sunk in darkness, its lights quietly spilling a pale yellow glow over the empty streets. Della sat there, one hand still resting on her belly, softly humming a wordless lullaby, and little by little, she fell asleep in that very position. She didn't know that the road ahead would be even harsher, that the people hiding in the darkness were still watching her, but she had something no power could ever take from her, the resolve of a mother willing to sacrifice everything to protect her child. A few days later, Della found temporary cleaning work in an old office building, the only job willing to take her without asking questions about her past, and her shift usually ended when the night had already grown very late. That evening, as she passed through the underground parking garage in the basement to reach the bus stop, the dim yellow lights flickered above her, throwing her shadow long and thin across the cold concrete floor. The space was empty, with only the echo of her own footsteps coming back to her. And then suddenly, from behind the rows of pillars, 3 burly figures stepped out and blocked her path. Della froze, instinct making her step backward as one hand moved to protect her belly. "Who are you?" She tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart was already pounding hard. "What do you want?" One of the men stepped forward, a faint, threatening smile on his face. "Don't be scared. We just need you to help us with one small thing." He said that as long as she agreed to come forward as a witness and claim that Royce Calloway had forced and threatened her, that he was the one behind all her troubles, not only would every theft accusation against her be erased, but she would also receive enough money to live comfortably with her child. Della understood at once what this was. They wanted to turn her into a pawn, to bring down the man who had helped her. They wanted her to trade a lie for the chance to falsely accuse her benefactor. She shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll never do that. Mr. Calloway has never done anything to harm me. I can't slander a decent man in exchange for money." The smile vanished from the man's face, replaced by a cold, threatening look. "You should think carefully," he hissed. "A woman like you doesn't have many choices, and you still have to think about that baby in your belly." They began closing in around her, pressing her step by step toward a hidden corner of the garage. Della backed away in panic, her back hitting the side of a car, leaving her with nowhere to run. As she desperately searched for a way out, her foot caught on the concrete curb and she fell to her knees, barely managing to brace herself with her hands to protect her belly as a frightened cry broke from her throat. At that most desperate moment, the sharp screech of tires echoed through the basement. A black car rushed in and braked hard. The doors flew open, and Royce and several of his men sprang out with lightning speed. He had assigned people to quietly follow and protect her from a distance, and when he received an abnormal signal, he hadn't delayed for even 1 second. With decisive and coldly controlled movements, Royce and his men subdued the hired thugs in the blink of an eye, neutralizing them one by one, shoving them face first onto the concrete floor and pinning them down. The 3 men who had been so aggressive only moments before now cowered helplessly, completely outmatched by him and his people. Royce wasted no words on them. He only released 1 sentence, cold as ice. "Tell whoever sent you that if he dares touch her one more time, I won't show mercy." Then he turned sharply, and all the hardness on his face vanished when he saw Della sitting curled on the ground. He immediately knelt beside her, supporting her shoulders with a gentleness almost impossible to believe. "Are you hurt? Does anything hurt? How's the baby?" Della lifted her face to look at him, and in that moment, through her tears, she truly saw the man before her for the first time. She saw a powerful man who could make large, brutal men submit in only a few seconds, but also that very same man trembling with worry for her and her child. Terror and tenderness, strength and compassion, all of it blended within the same person, and Della suddenly understood that the one who had been silently watching over and protecting her all this time wasn't merely a stranger who had happened to cross her path, but something far greater than she had ever imagined. Royce helped Della into the car, carefully settled her into the back seat, then signaled for the driver to take her to the hospital so she could be checked just to be safe. He sat down beside her, and beneath the flashes of streetlight spilling through the glass, he noticed that her hands were still trembling. Della tried to steady herself, then said softly, "I don't understand. Why did those men want me to falsely accuse you? And why do you always appear at the right moment to save me? You've already done too much for a stranger like me." Royce was silent for a long while. His eyes turned toward the window as though he were weighing something he had kept hidden in his heart for so many years. Then he slowly turned back to look at her, and for the first time, there was a rare tremor of emotion in his usually composed voice. "You truly don't recognize me?" he asked quietly. Della shook her head in confusion, not understanding what he meant. Royce drew in a deep breath, then said, "Many years ago, there was a man who was badly wounded, trapped with nowhere left to run on a rainy night. And when he thought he wouldn't survive, a girl opened a door and pulled him inside, bandaged his wound, and hid him from the men hunting him. That girl didn't ask who he was. She didn't fear being dragged into danger herself. She simply saved a life in silence, then left without needing even 1 word of thanks." Della went still, her eyes slowly widening as distant memories began to rise inside her. "That man," Royce continued, his voice trembling slightly, "was me. And the girl who saved me that night, the one I searched for all these years and could never find, was you, Della." The whole world seemed to stop inside that small car. Della lifted a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes blurring as the truth broke open in her mind. That rainy night from years ago, the act she had tucked away in some old drawer of memory, the thing that to her had simply been what anyone with a conscience would have done, had in fact been carved into this man's heart and carried with him through an entire stretch of life. "It was you," she whispered, tears rolling down her face. "I never knew. I didn't even clearly remember the face of the person I helped. I never thought that." Her voice caught, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Royce gave a slight nod, and in his eyes was a whole sky of gratitude held back for far too long. "You once saved me without asking who I was, without needing to know what I was worth," he said. "You gave me a chance to keep living when I was nothing in the eyes of the world. All these years, I promised myself that if one day I found you, I would repay that kindness. Now it's my turn, Della. It's my turn to protect you and your child, the way you once protected me." Della broke down crying, not from self-pity or pain, but from a wave of emotion so overwhelming she couldn't hold it back. For so many days, she had believed she was completely alone in this cold world, that no one truly stood on her side, and yet it turned out that all this time, the person silently watching over her and lifting her up was the very one into whose life she had unknowingly planted a seed of kindness many years before. She suddenly understood that the goodness she had given on that rainy night had never disappeared. It had only traveled a very long road in silence before returning to her at the exact moment she needed it most. She looked at Royce, and for the first time since she had known him, she no longer saw a distant benefactor or a powerful man to be wary of, but a human being with a heart that knew how to remember and cherish. Inside the car, as it moved quietly through the city night, two people once bound together by fate with an invisible thread finally recognized each other, and something warm began to grow between them. The examination results at the hospital showed that both Della and the baby were safe after the fall, and that made her breathe out in relief. But when she left the hospital, another problem appeared before her eyes. She no longer had anywhere to go. After Royce learned the truth of her situation, that she had lost her job, lost her place to live, and had been wandering for days without breathing a single word of it, he quietly offered to arrange a safe place for her, a proper apartment where she could rest peacefully until the day she gave birth. He said he didn't want her spending even one more night out on the streets, especially in her current condition. It should have been an offer that anyone in her circumstances would have accepted with joy. But for Della, it stirred up a struggle inside her heart. She stood still for a long time, her hands gripping the strap of her old bag, her eyes full of hesitation. One part of her longed to nod, to have a roof over her head, shelter from the rain and sun, a place to rest after days of exhaustion, not for herself, but for the child growing inside her day by day. But another part of her, the proud part that had followed her through her whole life, kept rising up in protest. "Mr. Calloway," she finally said, her voice small but clear, "I'm deeply grateful for everything you've done for my child and me. I truly am, but I'm afraid that if I accept even more help from you, I'll never be able to repay it all. I don't want to become a burden, and I don't want you to help me only because you feel indebted over what happened years ago." Royce looked at her, and he understood that the struggle inside her wasn't meaningless stubbornness, but an expression of the dignity that had made him respect her from the very beginning. "Della," he said slowly, "I'm not helping you out of pity, and not only to repay an old debt. You've shown me who you are. Even when you were pushed to the end of your road, you still refused to lie in order to harm me, even though one nod would have changed your life. A woman like you deserves help, not because you're weak, but because you're strong." Della lowered her head, her heart tangled and unsettled. She thought of the nights curled up at the bus station, thought of the cold and the fear that had surrounded her, and then she placed her hand over her belly, where her tiny child was sleeping peacefully. She realized that pride, no matter how precious, couldn't shield her child from the dangers outside. There were times when true strength didn't lie in facing everything alone, but in knowing how to accept a hand offered with sincerity. "I'll accept your help," she finally said softly, "but I hope you'll understand one thing. I see this as something I'm borrowing, not as a gift. When I'm steady on my feet again, I'll work. I'll take care of myself and my child, and I'll repay you in my own way. I can't lose my self-respect, because that's the only thing I still have left to teach my child one day." Royce smiled faintly, a smile filled with understanding and respect. "I agree," he replied, "and I believe you'll do exactly what you say." In that moment, between two people separated by an abyss of status and circumstance, a quiet understanding had been built. Della realized that she hadn't lost her self-respect by accepting his offer, because he had given it to her not with the condescending charity of someone bestowing a favor, but with respect for someone he saw as an equal. The quiet days in the apartment helped Della recover somewhat, but the storms that had come crashing down on her one after another, the fall in the parking garage, the long nights of fear and exhaustion, seemed to have left deeper marks than she had realized. One night, when she was nearing the final month of her pregnancy, Della startled awake as unusual pains came over her in repeated waves. She tried to breathe through them, telling herself they might only be ordinary signs, but the pain grew fiercer with every passing moment, until she could no longer stand steadily. She reached for her phone and called the only person she could think of then. Royce arrived only minutes later, and when he saw her pale face covered in sweat, he didn't say another word. He immediately lifted her into the car and drove straight to the hospital. All the way there, he held her hand tightly, constantly reassuring her, "Hold on, we're almost there. You and the baby will be all right. Stay with me." When they reached the hospital, the doctors and nurses immediately took her into the special care unit, and the door closed, leaving Royce standing alone outside in the silent hallway. And then began the longest night in the life of that powerful man. He sat down on the waiting chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the closed door at the end of the corridor. The entire city feared him. The whole underworld treated the Calloway name with caution. He held enough power and money in his hands to buy almost anything in this world. And yet now, sitting in this cold hospital hallway, he realized there were things for which all his power meant nothing. He couldn't step through that door, couldn't command fate, couldn't use his strength to seize safety for the 2 lives he was aching with worry over. For the first time in many years, the man who had always controlled everything felt utterly helpless. He rose, paced back and forth along the corridor, then sat down again, his eyes dark with exhaustion, but not for 1 second did they leave the door. Each tick of the clock passed slowly, stretching as though into eternity. There was a moment when he lowered his head, his shoulders, which had always seemed so steady, trembling faintly, and in the stillness of the night, one could see an entirely different Royce Calloway, not a cold crime lord, but only a man trembling with silent prayer for the safety of someone he cherished. He told himself that if he could have one wish, he would trade everything he had for Della and the baby to survive this night. Time kept moving, and when the first rays of dawn began to slip through the window at the end of the hallway, the door to the care room finally opened. A female doctor stepped out, her face tired but lit with relief. Royce sprang to his feet at once and hurried toward her, his eyes full of desperate pleading. "How is she? How is the baby?" he asked, his voice strained and unsteady. The doctor smiled gently. "Both mother and child have passed through the dangerous stage. Tonight was truly tense, but she's a very resilient mother. She fought with everything she had to keep her child safe. Now they both need rest, but you can feel relieved." Hearing that, Royce felt as though the 1,000-pound weight that had been crushing his chest all night had finally been lifted. He slowly closed his eyes, let out a long breath, and an emotion he had not allowed himself to show for far too long rose to the corners of his eyes. When he was allowed to visit, he stepped quietly to the bedside, where Della lay half asleep, her face pale but peaceful. He pulled a chair over and sat beside her, and for the first time, he gently took her hand, the hand with the crescent-shaped scar from years ago, placing upon it all his gratitude and a tenderness that he himself had only just begun to understand. During the days Della stayed in the hospital to recover, she gradually heard shocking news spreading throughout the city, and through each piece of it, she understood that Royce had quietly begun a reckoning of his own. He made no noise, needed no threats, but every move he made was as precise and merciless as a sentence handed down with no chance of appeal. The first thing she heard was that all the evidence behind the false accusation had been brought into the light. Royce's people had tracked down the greedy storeroom manager, and under pressure, he confessed everything, from the money he had received to the person who had been pulling the strings behind him. The recording of his confession, along with the suspicious money trail that had been traced backward, was delivered directly to the hotel management and to the places that needed to know. After only one night, the honor Della had once seen smeared was cleansed, and the truth that she had been the victim of a cowardly scheme was acknowledged by everyone. But that was only the beginning. Royce understood that the real man behind it all was Lincoln Brant and his desperate ally, Harlan Vance, and he aimed straight at the thing they valued most, money and power. With his far-reaching influence in the financial world, he quietly tightened every source of strength they had. The loans Harlan's company had been counting on were suddenly denied. The partners who had once made promises withdrew one by one, and accounts tied to questionable transactions began to be frozen for investigation. The Vance family's business empire, already unsteady, now collapsed quickly like a tower built on sand. As for Lincoln Brant, the man who had arrogantly believed he had found Royce's weakness, he never imagined that the very move aimed at Della would become the fatal mistake that pushed him into a corner. The territories he had spent so long building slipped from his hands one after another, and the men who had once followed him turned their backs when they realized he had angered the wrong man. Royce didn't need to resort to a single act of violence. He only needed to use his own network of power and his cold, calculated mind to choke his opponent little by little, forcing him to taste the feeling of losing everything that he himself had intended to inflict on someone else. News of the fall of the two families spread like a warning through high society and the underworld alike, showing just how heavy the price would be for anyone who dared trample on someone vulnerable under Calloway's protection. In that crisis, the relationship between Harlan and Cordelia shattered as well. When the family fortune vanished and their reputation crumbled, Harlan no longer had any patience left for the fiancée he believed was the source of every disaster. He coldly cut off all ties with her, leaving her to struggle alone in the ruins that her own arrogance had helped create. Cordelia, the woman who had once believed money and power would forever stand on her side, was now abandoned and completely isolated. The people who had once surrounded her with flattery now avoided her as though avoiding a disease, and the doors of high society through which she had once walked so proudly now closed before her all at once. Della listened to all of it with a complicated feeling she could barely describe. She felt no delight, no pleasure in another person's misfortune, because that wasn't her nature. But she understood that justice had finally been carried out, that the people who had driven her and her child to the edge now had to face the consequences of their own actions. And she also realized something deeper, that the man quietly protecting her wasn't only strong because of the power he held on the outside, but because of the unwavering principles within him, the clear line he drew between those who deserved punishment and those who deserved to be sheltered. One afternoon, after Della had been discharged from the hospital and returned to her quiet apartment, a hesitant knock sounded at the door. She opened it and froze when she recognized the person standing before her. It was Cordelia Vance. But this was no longer the arrogant woman in the dazzling red dress who had once forced Della's head toward the mirror. The woman standing there now looked worn down and hollow, her hair no longer carefully styled, her eyes sunken from sleeplessness, her body wrapped in clothes so plain they were almost hard to believe. All the glamour and arrogance from before had vanished, leaving behind only a person sinking in despair. Cordelia looked at Della, her lips trembling, and then the unthinkable happened. She slowly lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice choking. "I know I have no right to come here, but I have nowhere else to go. I've lost everything. My family has turned their backs on me, my friends avoid me, and no one is willing to help me. You're the only person who can speak a word for me to Mr. Calloway. Please, just one word, please have mercy on me." Della quietly looked at the woman before her, the woman who had once caused her so much pain and humiliation. In that moment, if she had been someone else, perhaps she would have felt satisfied, watching the person who once trampled on her now bow her head and beg. But there wasn't even a trace of pleasure in Della's heart. She only felt a faint sadness and a strange compassion for someone who had destroyed her own life with her own hands. She didn't invite Cordelia inside, but she didn't slam the door shut either. She looked directly into Cordelia's reddened eyes and spoke in a calm voice heavy with meaning. "Miss Vance, do you know why everyone has turned away from you? It isn't because you lost your money or your status. It's because when you still held all those things in your hands, you used them to trample on others instead of lifting them up." Cordelia looked up, stunned. Della continued, "There are things that money, no matter how much of it you have, can never buy. Self-respect and kindness. I was once so poor I didn't even have a place to lay my head, but I never lost those two things, and they were what kept me standing when I had nothing left. As for you, you once had everything in your hands, but you had already lost those things long before you lost your fortune." Each word Della spoke was like a mirror reflecting back everything Cordelia had done, leaving her unable to say a word, only standing there in silence as tears streamed down her face. "I'm not the person you need to beg," Della said softly, "and I don't have the right to decide your fate. But if you truly want to begin again, then what you need isn't someone to speak on your behalf. What you need is to learn how to treat people with respect, no matter who they are or where they stand." Cordelia stood still for a long time, then finally gave a faint nod, hurriedly wiped her tears, and turned away in silence, without a word of resentment or excuse. Her steps no longer carried the pride they once had, but in that quietness, it seemed that something inside her had begun to shift. Della closed the door, leaned her back against it, and let out a soft sigh. She didn't know whether her words had truly awakened that woman or not, but she knew she had chosen to answer cruelty with compassion, and that was how she protected her own dignity, the dignity that no one could ever take away from her. When the truth about the plot to frame her was brought into the light, Della's life began turning toward a new chapter, one she herself hadn't dared dream of during her darkest days. The management of the Ashworth Grand Hotel, after reviewing all the evidence and the confession of the storeroom manager, officially sent her a formal apology. Mrs. Petrova came to see her in person, and the usually stern woman couldn't hide the regret in her voice. She said she had always believed Della was an honest person, and that she had been tormented all this time because she hadn't been able to protect her from those unjust accusations. The hotel not only restored Della's honor publicly, but also offered to bring her back to work in a better position with treatment worthy of what she had endured, as a way to make amends for everything she had suffered. News that she had been cleared spread quickly, and the people who had once turned their backs on her, who had once whispered behind her back, now looked at her with completely different eyes, with respect mixed with guilt. Former co-workers came to apologize for having been too quick to believe the rumors, and Della, with the compassion that had always lived in her heart, accepted all of it without a word of blame. She understood that holding on to resentment would only make her own heart heavier, and she chose to let go so she could move forward with a peaceful soul. But what moved her most wasn't the restoration of her honor or her job, but the way the small community around her began to change. The story of a poor pregnant woman pushed to the edge, yet still refusing to lie in order to harm the man who had helped her, still holding fast to her self-respect even after losing everything, quietly touched many hearts. There were strangers who came only to express their admiration, and there were other single mothers who took her story as something to lean on, to believe that goodness would one day be repaid. Della realized that everything she had gone through, no matter how painful, had not been meaningless after all, because it had become a quiet reminder to those around her of the value of honesty and resilience. Della considered the hotel's invitation to return, and in the end, she decided to accept, but not immediately. She would come back after giving birth and after her health was strong enough to begin again. She wanted to stand firmly on her own 2 feet, wanted to prove that the place she held was earned through her ability and character, not through anyone's pity. When Royce learned of her decision, he only smiled faintly and respected her choice, because he understood that this was exactly who Della was, a woman who always wanted to write her own fate through her own effort. In the days that followed, Della's life gradually flowed into a peace she hadn't had for a very long time. She no longer had to live in fear of shadows watching from the dark. She no longer had to brace herself against slander or schemes meant to destroy her. She had a safe roof under which to rest, enough health to prepare for the day she would welcome her child into the world, and more important than anything, she had regained the most precious thing others had once tried to steal from her, her honor and the calm within her soul. Every morning when she woke, she placed her hand on the large curve of her belly, smiled at the tiny life soon to be born, and felt her heart fill with a hope she had thought she had lost long ago. She knew there were still many things waiting ahead, but this time, she no longer had to face them alone. A few weeks later, on an early spring morning when warm, gentle sunlight poured through the window of the hospital room, the clear and healthy cry of a tiny new life rang out, marking the most sacred moment in Della's life. After all the storms she had survived, the child she had struggled day and night to protect finally came safely into the world, a healthy baby boy with rosy cheeks and a cry full of life. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Della lowered her head to look at him, and all the exhaustion, pain, and humiliation she had once tasted suddenly melted away, leaving only a pure happiness swelling in her chest. She gently pressed her little child against her heart, tears rolling down her cheeks while a radiant smile bloomed on her lips, and she whispered the tenderest words of love to him, telling him that he had come into this world safely, and that from now on, he would always be protected and loved by his mother. She gave him a name that carried the meaning of hope and light, as a reminder that no matter how long the night may be, dawn will always come. A short while later, Royce came to visit mother and child with a small bouquet of flowers in his hand, and when he saw Della holding her baby in her arms in that room filled with sunlight, the face of that once cold man softened into a rare, warm smile. He quietly sat down beside her, silently gazing at the sleeping baby. And in that peaceful moment, he asked for nothing. Not one word about the kindness owed to him or the sacrifices he had made. To him, seeing the woman who had saved his life years ago, now safe and happy beside her healthy child, was the fullest repayment of all. The final circle of gratitude closed in the most complete way. Della looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and with a warm feeling that had quietly begun to grow, without her even realizing when it started. And she understood that from now on, the road ahead for her and her child would no longer be lonely. They didn't rush to name the feeling growing between them, but let it blossom naturally with time, because both of them understood that the most beautiful things always need to be nurtured with sincerity and respect. In the gentle sunlight of that early spring morning, 3 people, or more truly, a small family slowly taking shape, turned together toward a promising new future, where the painful past had closed to make room for hope and love. Della's story is a profound reminder to all of us that the kindness we give, no matter how small, and even if it seems to be forgotten by the years, will never truly disappear, but someday will return to warm our own lives at the moment we need it most. That a person's dignity and self-respect are never measured by money or status, but by the way they hold fast to goodness even in the most desperate circumstances. And that those who choose to trample on the vulnerable will eventually have to face the consequences of their own actions, because what we sow is what we will reap. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share so you can listen to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Della and Royce's story? And have you drawn anything from it for yourself? Please leave a comment below to share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always hoping to hear your voice. Once again, thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful, peaceful life, and love overflowing every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.